20 floors up, the lights were still on. The rest of Atlanta had gone quiet. Past midnight, the kind of quiet that belongs to cleaning carts and empty hallways, and men who work when no one is watching. The city below breathed slow. The buildings across Peachtree held their light like they were waiting for something. On the 18th floor of a glass tower in Midtown, a whiteboard covered an entire wall. Equations. Arrows. A warning in red capital letters. Critical path. Do not risk. A door opened, not an engineer, not a director, not anyone whose name appeared on the organizational chart above the third tier. A man in a gray uniform, pushing a cart, moving through the room the way he moved through every room, efficient, unhurried, invisible by design. He was supposed to wipe the table, empty the bin, turn off the light. Instead, he stopped, looked at the board, and picked up a marker. Atlanta doesn't sleep in October. The city just shifts. Slows down a little after midnight. The highway hum drops to something quieter, something almost human, like the whole place is finally breathing instead of running. The dogwood trees along Peachtree stand bare. At this hour, their leaves gone rust and copper, catching the orange of the streetlights in a way that makes the whole boulevard look like it's smoldering. And on the 18th floor of Mercer Apex Systems, the last engineer packed up his laptop at 10:47 p.m., turned off his monitor, and left the whiteboard exactly as it was. Critical path. Do not erase. He probably figured nobody would touch it until morning. He was wrong. He was wrong. Darnell Cooper pushed his cart through the hallway at 11:12 p.m., and the wheels made that sound they always made on the tile near the elevator bank. A soft, rhythmic squeak. The kind of sound that belongs to buildings after hours. The kind nobody hears unless they're the one making it. He was 36 years old, and he had been making that sound for 2 years. Before that, he was making other sounds in other buildings, the crack of a ratchet wrench in a machine shop in Decatur, the thud of lumber stacked outside a housing development in East Point, the beep of a register at a hardware store on Memorial Drive that paid $11 an hour and smelled like motor oil and synthetic rope. He had worked all of those jobs with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. No complaints, no drama, just the work and then going home to Zoe. Always Zoe. She was 9 years old, and she was the reason he had left MIT without a degree, and the reason he did not spend much time feeling sorry about it. When Diane died, the math was simple. Brutal, but simple. Zoe was 2.5, almost 3. His mother-in-law had bad knees and lived 4 states away. His own mother worked nights at a care facility in Savannah. The scholarships didn't cover childcare. Nothing covered grief. And a child doesn't pause while you figure out the logistics of catastrophe. So he left. He took Zoe and he left Boston, and he drove Boston's and the stove until the rent made sense, and the school district had decent ratings, and there was a night shift opening that wouldn't require him to be somewhere at 6 in the morning when Zoe needed breakfast, and a story about whatever she was obsessed with that week. 6 years ago, that drive had felt like retreat. Now it felt like the only right decision he had ever made under pressure. 2 years ago, it was marine biology. Lately, it was coding. Specifically, she had gotten interested in the Pixel Dragon game Darnell had built for her on a second-hand laptop when she was 3 years old, not to play it anymore, but to understand how it worked. She had started asking questions about the delay in Sparks's movement, the gap between button press and response, and Darnell had explained latency to her over dinner one evening, and she had nodded with the gravity of someone filing important information. Last week, she had asked if she could look at the source code. He had showed her. He had coded that game at the kitchen table, same as everything else that required concentration, where he ate cereal standing at 5 a.m. before Zoe woke, where he read machine learning papers on his phone between bites, where he kept a composition notebook filled with the kind of math that had no practical application to his current employment, but that he could not stop doing any more than he could stop breathing. 9 years since MIT. Not one of those years had he stopped thinking the way MIT had taught him to think. The thinking had just gone underground. The way a river goes underground in dry country, still moving, still finding its level, just out of sight. Terry Coleman had hired him knowing none of this. Terry was 55 and had supervised the night cleaning crew at Mercer Apex for 7 years. And his primary criterion for a new hire was whether they showed up and whether they could be trusted with a key. Darnell showed up. Darnell could be trusted. 2 weeks in, Terry gave him the key card to the 18th floor and said the engineering suite needed to be done by midnight. They were particular about their equipment. Particular was one word for it. The 18th floor was different from the floors below. The carpet was newer. The air smelled like server cooling and dry erase markers and the particular staleness of rooms where people worked too hard for too long. There were glass-walled conference rooms and a lab with equipment. Darnell didn't touch on a smaller room near Stestwell, the Steck, that someone had converted into a secondary lounge with a coffee maker that probably cost more than his car. But the machine shop had also had expensive equipment. The difference was that nobody here looked at him when he moved through a room. He knew every corner of this floor. He knew which light fixture above the fire exit flickered every 40 minutes, and which door to the supply closet needed to be pulled hard before it would lock. He knew that the lead engineer, a broad-shouldered man named Victor Bryant, who always worked latest and always left his coffee mug on top of the printer instead of in the sink, had a habit of leaving his dry erase markers uncapped, which was why the markers in the main conference room were always drying out, which was a minor irritation, which Darnell had solved by keeping a spare set in his cart that he swapped in every Tuesday. Nobody knew he did that. Nobody knew most of what Darnell did. That was the nature of the job. You became part of the infrastructure, present enough to be useful, invisible enough to be forgotten. He reached the main conference room at 11:17. The door was closed, but the light was on, which was unusual. Someone had forgotten to switch it off when they left. Not his problem, except that he was supposed to clean the room, and leaving the light on for a guest who wasn't there felt like an error worth correcting. He swiped his card, pushed the door open, stepped inside. The whiteboard covered the entire right wall, floor to ceiling, wide enough that you'd have to walk to read it end to end. And it was full. Not messy full, not brainstorm full, architecturally full. Equations stacked in deliberate columns, arrows linking nodes, subscripts and superscripts, arranged with the kind of precision that meant someone had been at this for hours. In the top right corner, thick red letters, "Critical path, do not harass." Darnell looked at it. He was going to look away. He was going to do his job, wipe the tables, empty the bin, straighten the chairs, turn off the light on his way out. He was going to. Except his eyes moved left of their own accord, caught a cluster of equations near the center of the board. Stopped. Something in his chest went still in the way it went still. When a problem was showing him something it shouldn't be able to show him. Not a feeling he could explain to someone who hadn't lived inside mathematics. A wrongness that was almost physical. Like stepping down a staircase in the dark and expecting another step that isn't there, that lurch, that split second of the body, catching up to what the mind already knew. The model was linear, the behavior it was modeling was not. He stood there for almost a full minute, because he could be wrong. It happened. He was a man who read papers on his phone at a kitchen table at midnight. Not a man with letters after his name and a conference room that smelled like peppermint breath mints. He could be wrong, except he wasn't. He could see it clearly. They were applying a linear regression framework to a system with cyclical, non-linear behavior patterns. Traffic data had to be, given the node labels and the variable naming conventions, a predictive model for traffic behavior. And traffic didn't move in straight lines. Traffic moved in rhythms, morning rhythms and evening rhythms, and Friday before a holiday rhythms and back to school rhythms. You couldn't flatten that into linearity without bleeding accuracy from every edge. The model would produce numbers. The numbers would look correct at small scale. And at large scale, under real-world load, they would drift until the whole system walked itself off a cliff. He looked at the board for another 30 seconds. Then he did something he had never done before on any floor of any building he had ever cleaned. He picked up a red marker, not to erase, to annotate. He found a clear section of board near the problematic cluster, drew a sigmoid curve with careful strokes, labeled the X and Y axes, circled the two variables that had been transposed, and wrote 4 words in lowercase beside node 7, weighted node misaligned C7b. Then he stepped back, looked at it, thought about it, looked again, nodded once, put the cap back on the marker, set it in the tray. Then he finished cleaning the room, turned off the light, and pushed his cart back into the hallway. He had 3 more rooms before 4 a.m. Lorraine Mitchell did not sleep well on Wednesdays. This had been true for most of her adult life, and she had long since stopped trying to diagnose it. Wednesday was the hinge of the week, the day when the momentum of Monday and Tuesday ran up against the weight of everything still undone, and the collision was not comfortable. She lay in her apartment in Midtown and stared at the ceiling and thought about the federal demo and ran the numbers in her head for the 14th time that week and got the same answer she'd gotten the previous 13 times, which was that the answer was not good enough. The United States Department of Transportation didn't give second demos. You got your window, you showed them the system. It worked or it didn't. And if the predictive accuracy on live traffic data came in under 80%, the contract, the one she had spent 11 months negotiating, the one that represented the most significant federal relationship in Mercer Apex's 12-year history, would go to the team in Dallas who had pitched something shinier and slower. She had built Mercer Apex from a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur, she and Gary Young. 12 years ago, when Gary was a systems engineer with a bad knee and good instincts, and Lorraine was 30 years old and had exactly 1 investor who believed in her and 17 who had passed. They had built it out of late nights and second-hand servers and the stubbornness of people who have already lost what mattered most and have nothing left to protect except the thing they're trying to build. 41 years old now. 340 employees, a glass tower in Midtown with her name on the founding documents, and she was lying in the dark at 12:30 a.m., running long division in her head because the algorithm her team had spent 9 months building had a problem she couldn't name and a demo in 48 hours she couldn't postpone. She was up by 5, at the office by 6:30. She did this, sometimes came in before the building came alive, before the badge readers started clicking and the elevator music started cycling. And Victor Bryant set up his triple monitor and made the entire floor smell like the dark roast blend he ordered from somewhere online that cost more per ounce than Lorraine's first car payment. The 18th floor was quiet, gray light coming through the eastern windows. Her footsteps on the tile, her keycard, the hiss of the conference room door. She reached for the light switch, turned it on, walked to the whiteboard with her coffee in one hand and her tablet in the other, stopped. There was new writing on the board. Red marker. Small, careful lowercase letters. A sigmoid curve drawn cleanly in a clear section to the left of the main cluster. 2 circled variables. 4 words near node 7. Lorraine set her coffee down. She read it once. Then she picked up her tablet and opened the simulation software and entered the corrections indicated by the annotations. Not because she was certain they were right, because she needed to know either way. 8 seconds. The accuracy bar moved. 18.4% improvement. Error reduction, 61.3. Latency down 22 milliseconds. She stood very still in the empty conference room with the morning light coming in gray, and, even through the windows and the tablet showing her numbers, she had spent 48 hours trying to produce herself. Someone had done this in the margin of someone else's work, in lowercase. At some point after 10:47 p.m., she looked at the annotation again. The hand was not any hand she recognized, not Victor's broad architectural print, Not Angela Thomas's left-leaning cursive. Not anyone on her engineering team. She pulled out her phone, called security, asked them to pull the camera footage from the 18th floor conference room between 10:30 and 4. The footage arrived in her inbox by 7:15, a man in a grey uniform, pushing a cleaning cart. He entered the room at 11:17, moved through his routine tasks with the efficiency of long practice, then stopped at the whiteboard, stood there for approximately 60 seconds without moving, then took a marker and wrote for 4 minutes 12 seconds. Replaced the cap, set the marker down, finished the remaining tasks in the room, turned off the light, left his face. When he glanced back at the board from the doorway, showed nothing except the focused neutrality of a man, checking whether he'd forgotten something. He hadn't forgotten anything. He'd left something behind. Lorraine called Gary before 8. Pull the employment file for the night cleaning crew, 18th floor. I need the name of whoever was on last night. A pause on his end. Good morning to you too, Lorraine. Good morning. The name, Gary. Give me 10 minutes. It took him 4. His voice came back with a different quality, careful, the way Gary got when information surprised him and he hadn't finished deciding what to do with it. Darnell Cooper. Been here 2 years. Terry Coleman's crew. Clean record. Strong evaluations. Terry actually flagged him as the most reliable person he's had in 7 years. Why does Terry give his cleaning staff security clearance to engineering floors? Standard protocol for late-night maintenance access. The conference rooms have motion sensor alerts that get disabled during authorized cleaning windows to avoid false triggers from the HVAC. Camera system logs access, but the monitoring room only has staff from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. budget constraint from 2 years ago that we never revisited. Fix that after the demo. What else do you have on Cooper? Employment application says he attended MIT. Didn't finish. No degree listed. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. He improved our predictive model by 18% at 11:30 last night. A longer pause. Say that again. She said it again. The engineering team arrived at 8. Lorraine had rearranged the morning. No coffee small talk. No easing in. She put the corrected simulation results on the main screen before anyone had sat down fully and watched their faces process numbers that contradicted 9 months of their own work. Victor Bryant was the first to speak. He was 38, meticulous, Carnegie Mellon. The kind of engineer who treated intellectual precision as a moral position. He leaned forward, looked at the board, looked at the screen, looked at Lorraine. Who ran this simulation? I did. At 6:50 this morning, based on what parameters? Lorraine pointed to the annotations, the red marker, the sigmoid curve, the 4 words near node 7. Victor stood and walked to the board. Read it in silence. His jaw did something subtle, a slight tightening that Lorraine had learned, over 2 years of working with him, meant he was recalibrating rather than responding. He turned around. This isn't from our team, no. Then who? The man who cleaned this room last night. The silence in that room was the kind that happens when smart people encounter information that doesn't fit any available category. Not disbelief exactly. More like a hard system reboot. People who build their professional identity around intelligence have a specific reaction when intelligence arrives from a direction they didn't anticipate. It looks like stillness. It is not stillness. Victor's voice came out careful and controlled. You're telling me a janitor corrected our algorithm. I'm telling you someone with a marker. And 4 minutes corrected an error that 11 engineers missed in 9 months. She let that sit. The question I'd like answered is not who he is. The question is why we didn't find this ourselves. Nobody answered that question. Angela Thomas, 29, junior on the team, sat at the far end of the table with her pen hovering above her notebook, and the expressions of someone who understood exactly what had just happened and was deciding whether it was acceptable to find it as remarkable as she clearly did. She looked at the board, looked at her own notes from 3 weeks ago, set her pen down. Victor sat back down. We should validate independently before the demo. I already did. Angela, run your own validation this morning. I want a second set of numbers by 10. Angela's pen moved. On it. And I want everyone to understand something. Lorraine's voice didn't rise. It never did, which was part of why people paid attention when she spoke. Tomorrow afternoon we stand in front of Kathleen Robinson and the Federal Review Committee with a system that works, or a system that doesn't. How it got to working is a conversation for after. Right now, it needs to work. Angela's numbers came back at 9:52. They matched 18.4, 61.3, 22 milliseconds. The demo team spent the rest of Wednesday running scenario tests, stress testing the corrected model against historical datasets, checking for edge cases. Victor found one, a low traffic corridor variable that needed a minor adjustment, and corrected it himself with the focused irritation of a man who is angry at a problem, and not at the person who revealed it, which was perhaps the most charitable interpretation of his mood that the room could support. But it was the accurate one. By 7 that evening, the system was more stable than it had been at any point in the previous 3 weeks. Gary found Lorraine at the window, in her office at 7:15. He came in without knocking, which was his right as CTO and her oldest professional ally, and stood next to her and looked out at the city lights going on in the early dark below. "You're going to talk to him tonight? What are you going to say?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet, but I know he comes in at 10. Gary looked at her sideways. "He's going to be surprised. He should be. So should we." She picked up her coffee. "Go home, Gary. We have a long day tomorrow." After he left, she stayed at the window for another 20 minutes. Not worrying about the demo. She had done everything she could about the demo. She was thinking about the man in the grey uniform who had stood in the dark in front of a whiteboard and seen what a team of 11 engineers had missed. Not because he was performing, not because anyone was watching, because he apparently couldn't not see it. She had known exactly 3 people in her life with that quality, the inability to walk past a problem without trying to solve it. Her grandmother Catherine had it, which was what made her a remarkable nurse and a challenging houseguest. Gary had it, at his best, and Lorraine herself had it, or used to. Before the mechanics of running a company had gradually replaced the pleasure of building one, she was curious about Darnell Cooper the way she was curious about very few things. Not as an asset. As a phenomenon. He arrived at 10:03. The 18th floor was quiet. The cleaning crew had started on the lower floors. Darnell swiped his card at the elevator and stepped out into the hallway. And there was the cart where Terry had left it at the end of the previous shift, restocked, ready. He put in his earbuds. One dangling, one in enough to have something to listen to, not enough to miss a sound he needed to hear. He'd been working through a lecture series on neural network architecture. The professor's voice was dry and methodical and oddly soothing. At this hour, the way a metronome is soothing, the way anything with a reliable rhythm becomes its own kind of comfort when most of the world is asleep, he pushed the cart to the first room. Did what he did. Moved on. He reached the main conference room at 11:21. The light was on. He stopped. 2 nights in a row. He pushed open the door with his shoulder, cart first, and then he saw Lorraine Mitchell sitting at the head of the conference table, with her hands folded in front of her and a cup of coffee, and her tablet and an expression that said, and she had been expecting him for exactly this moment. Darnell stopped. His first instinct was the animal awareness that the room had changed its nature. Yesterday it was an empty room with a problem on the wall. Tonight it had a person in it. A specific person, whose face he recognized from the employee communications board near the badge readers, the ones he walked past every night without being particularly interested in them. CO. Lorraine Mitchell.
Founding partner.
12 years with the company. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I can come back." He already knew that wasn't what was happening. No. "Come in." The kind of instruction that doesn't require a raised voice to carry weight. "Sit down." He left the cart in the doorway, walked to the nearest chair, not close to her, not at the far end, sat, back straight. She looked at him the way people who are used to making assessments quickly look at someone they haven't categorized yet. Not unkind. Thorough. I watched the camera footage this morning. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. You were in here for about 16 minutes. The annotation took just under 5. You didn't pause to check anything. You didn't seem uncertain, a slight tilt of her head. Were you? About which part? Whether you were right, he considered that honestly. I was less certain than I looked, but not uncertain enough to leave it blank. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. Run me through what you saw. So he did. Not performed, not condensed for palatability. He walked her through the logic the way he walked Zoe through. Why the sky looked different colors, at different times of day, starting from what you can see, working toward what it means, making sure each step made sense before adding the next. He talked about the cyclical nature of traffic behavior, about why a linear model produces numbers that look correct at small scale and collapse at large scale, like a bridge engineered for moderate loads that holds until the stadium lets out and 10,000 cars hit the on-ramp at once. He talked for about 4 minutes. Then he stopped. Lorraine was looking at him differently than she had been. Not warmer, more focused. MIT, she said. How did you? Employment records this morning. She said it without apology. You attended. Left before finishing. Why? He looked at the table for 1 second. Just one. My wife died. I had a daughter who was almost 3. The room absorbed it, the way rooms absorb things said quietly that carry real weight. Lorraine did not offer condolences in the reflexive way. She paused long enough that the pause meant something. How long ago? 6.5 years, and since then, a lot of different things. Repair work. Construction. Here for the last 2 years, he looked at her steadily. I read. Whatever I can access. Research papers, documentation, open source repositories. At night after my daughter goes to sleep, your daughter, Zoe. She's 9. She started asking about the source code in a game I built for her when she was 3. Something moved behind Lorraine's eyes, not sentiment, but recognition. She looked at the whiteboard, the original equations, his annotations still visible in red beside them. She didn't look at them like she was checking his work. She had already checked his work. She looked at them the way you look at something you're still deciding the full meaning of. The demo is tomorrow at 2, she said finally. I want you in the building. What does that mean? Present. Not in the room for the demo itself, but available on a separate floor with monitoring access, in case I need a technical question answered quickly. He was quiet for a moment. I'm a janitor. Right now, you're the person who fixed our algorithm. The job title comes after. She stood, picked up her tablet. What time does your daughter need to be at school? 7:45. Be here by 9. Tell Terry Coleman you have a reassignment in the morning. I'll make sure he knows. She moved toward the door. He stayed seated for a half second because his brain was running about 4 beats behind the conversation. Ms. Mitchell, she turned. I didn't do it to interfere with anything. I saw something and I couldn't not write it down. She looked at him for a moment with that same assessment that was not unkind. I know. A pause. That's actually the part I find most interesting about this whole thing. Then she was gone. Her heels quiet on the tile down the hall. Darnell sat in the conference room alone, the whiteboard, his annotations in red beside the critical path equations. The window showing Atlanta at nearly midnight. Lights on in the buildings across the street where other people were working late for reasons he would never know. He got up, finished cleaning the room, pushed the cart back into the hall. He had 4 more rooms before 4. He didn't tell Zoe that night. She was asleep when he got home at 4:48, curled into the middle third of the couch with the specific structural confidence of a child who has never worried about falling. Her composition notebook, she'd started keeping one, copying him. Copying was on the floor, where it had slipped from her hand. He put a blanket over her and set the notebook on the coffee table and stood there for a minute doing inventory. She was breathing. She was fine. Everything else was secondary to that. He ate cereal over the sink. read for 40 minutes, slept for 3 hours, got up at 8, made Zoe's lunch peanut butter on toast cut diagonal because she had opinions about sandwiches, an apple, a juice box, and a note in the bottom of the bag that said if the code isn't running, check the brackets first because this was currently her preferred form of philosophical encouragement. Dropped her at school. She hugged him around the middle with her whole body, the way she'd done since she was small, like anchoring. "You're different today," she said into his jacket. "I'm the same as always." She pulled back and looked up at him with the specific evaluative gaze of someone who has been studying his face for her entire conscious life. No. Something happened. She wasn't asking. Good something or work something? Might be both. She nodded, satisfied with the honesty. Then she turned and walked through the gate with the total forward momentum of a person who has already decided what kind of day she's going to have. He watched her go. 9 years old and already keeping a composition notebook. He drove to Mercer Apex. The demo was at 2. He spent the morning in a small conference room on the 16th floor with a laptop and a connection to the monitoring dashboard. Not the main room, not the room with the federal committee and Lorraine and Kathleen Robinson, who he would not meet for weeks, just a screen. Numbers updating in real time. He sat with his composition notebook open on the table and watched the dashboard. The system ran the initial demonstration sequence. Numbers moved. He made notes. He was watching the response pattern in the feedback loop, a potential drift vector that would only matter if the committee asked for live data. A different problem from the one he'd fixed on the whiteboard. Not a crisis, a contingency. He wrote it in the notebook, labeled it, considered it from 3 angles. At 2:47 p.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown internal extension. They asked for live data. Angela Thomas's voice, tight and efficient. "We're pulling the live Atlanta traffic feed. Can you look at the loop response on the dashboard?" He was already looking. "I see it. The drift is minimal. You have about 40 seconds of stable window before it starts showing. What do we do?" "Nothing. Let it run." "The window is enough." He watched the numbers. "It's going to look clean to them." 7 seconds of silence. The feed on his dashboard updated. "It's clean," Angela said. "They're looking at it. It's holding." He exhaled through his nose. "Put the notebook down, thank you," she said. Not warmth, a professional who had needed information and gotten it. But she had said it, which was something. He stayed in the room until 4:30. The committee wrapped. The review team left. He watched the numbers stabilize, and then he packed up his notebook and took the elevator down and walked out into an October afternoon in Atlanta, where the light was the specific gold of late afternoon in the South, long and warm and faintly sorrowful, like the season making its case before it left. He sat in his car for 10 minutes. He knew a federal demo had gone well. He knew a hinge had turned somewhere in a room he hadn't been in. He knew that Lorraine Mitchell had put him in position to be Ushi of today, and that he had been useful, quietly from a different floor. He knew he had a shift starting at 10, and Zoe needed dinner at 6, and Patricia Johnson downstairs had agreed to sit with her until he got back. He drove home, made rice and chicken, helped Zoe debug a loop in a simple program she was writing, her first real attempt. 8 lines of Python that was supposed to count to 10 and currently counted to 9 because she'd used less than instead of less than or equal to. He showed her the fix. She stared at it for a moment and then said, "That's the same mistake as a fence with 1 post too few." He looked at her. "Off by 1 error," she said. I read about it. He was washing dishes when his phone buzzed. A text from an internal Mercer Apex number he didn't recognize. "Tomorrow morning. Terry will have a message for you." He read it twice. Put the phone face down on the counter, dried his hands. Looked out the kitchen window at the Atlanta night. The buildings of Midtown visible from here on clear evenings. Their lights stacked up against the dark like a problem waiting to be solved. Monday arrived the way Mondays arrive, when something has shifted beneath the surface, looking exactly like every other Monday, but carrying different weight. Same drive, same parking structure, Same badge reader at the entrance. Except when he reached the security desk, Terry Coleman was standing instead of sitting, which was the first signal. And his expression was the specific expression of a man trying to figure out which version of news lands best. Darnell. Terry held something out. A badge. Same photo. Different color. Blue under his name, where it had said janitorial staff for 2 years, it now said technical contractor executive access. He looked at it. He turned it over once. He looked at Terry. Terry's voice came out like a man reading something he's still not entirely sure he believes. There's someone on 18 who wants to see you at 10:30. Darnell took the badge. He put it in his shirt pocket, right next to the composition notebook. Took the elevator, 10th floor, 14th floor, 18th floor. The doors opened onto the engineering suite, and the air smelled like server cooling and dry erase markers. The same as it always did. The same as it did at midnight, when the only sound was his cartwheels and a professor's voice explaining gradient descent in his left ear. Same floor. Different key. He stood in the hallway for a moment before moving. He thought about Zoe at the school gate. Something happened. He thought about 9 years of kitchen table mathematics that had no audience and no payoff, except the private satisfaction of understanding a thing. He thought about a whiteboard and a red marker, and 4 minutes he had not planned and could not undo, and was not sure he wanted to. He thought about the blue badge in his pocket. Then he walked down the hall toward the conference room where Lorraine Mitchell was already waiting, her tablet open, her coffee in hand, the morning light coming through the east windows in a long, clear stripe across the table between them. Whatever this was, it had begun. 3 tests. No name on the envelope. That was Lorraine's condition. Gary Young had looked at her across her desk when she explained it, and said nothing for a long moment, which was his version of asking whether she was sure. She was sure. If the numbers were going to mean anything, they needed to be clean. Untouched by the story of who Darnell Cooper was, or where he'd been found, or what color his badge used to be. Just the work. Just the answers. Just the math standing on its own, without the weight of context pressing down on it from every side. Gary took the tests home that Friday evening in a manila folder. Darnell received his copy through Terry Coleman the same afternoon, folded twice and paper-clipped to a note in Lorraine's handwriting that said only 3 weeks. No deadline before that. No one knows except me and Gary. Darnell stood in the supply room on the 15th floor, reading that note. Read it once. Folded it. Put it in the same pocket as the composition notebook. Then he finished his shift. He didn't tell anyone. Not Patricia Johnson downstairs, who would have been proud in the particular loud way. She was proud of everything Darnell did, and would have mentioned it to her sister in Marietta by morning. Not Terry, who deserved to know, but who had a mouth that meant well and moved quickly. Not Zoe, because Zoe was 9 and deeply analytical and would have immediately started asking questions he didn't have answers to. Yet questions about what happened if he passed, what happened if he didn't, what it meant for their routine, whether he'd still be home for dinner. She would have asked all of these, in the same calm, methodical tone she brought to debugging her code, and he didn't have the bandwidth to be interrogated by his own daughter when he hadn't yet interrogated himself. He just started working the kitchen table, every night after Zoe went to sleep. The same table where everything happened that mattered in this apartment, homework, dinner, the grief in the early months that he didn't have language for yet, and mostly just sat inside of while the city moved on outside the window. He opened the first test at 9:47 p.m. on a Friday, and he stayed at that table until 1:30 a.m., with the composition notebook open beside him and a mechanical pencil he'd had since his last semester at MIT. That still worked because he'd been careful with it for 9 years. The way you're careful with the things that connect you to who you used to be. The first test was systems architecture, conceptual. He knew this territory the way he knew the 18th floor, not because he'd mapped it recently, but because maps like that don't fully dissolve. They go quiet. They wait. He worked through it steadily, made notes, corrected himself twice in the margins. Finished at 12:15 and spent the remaining time checking his work the way he'd been taught and the way he'd never stopped doing, even when there was no one to hand the work to. The second test was applied machine learning. Harder, not because the concepts were beyond him, but because some of the notation had evolved in the years since he'd been formally studying, and he had to back-calculate two conventions from context before he could be certain he was answering what was actually being asked. He spent 40 minutes on one problem, not stuck, thinking. There was a difference, and he had learned a long time ago not to confuse the two. Stuck was when the path closed. Thinking was when you were still finding it. The third test had a section he'd never encountered in any paper or documentation he'd read on his kitchen table. A proposed system with a structural inefficiency baked into the design. Not a trick, a genuine flaw, the kind that looks load-bearing until you trace the actual dependencies and realize the whole section is decorative. He spent an hour and 15 minutes building an alternative from the component level up. Simpler, 3 fewer steps. The kind of solution that only looks obvious after someone has found it, which was the signature of every good solution he'd ever seen, the way it made the original problem seem almost embarrassing in retrospect. He finished the tests on a Tuesday night in the second week, sealed them in the envelope, left them on Terry's desk before his shift started. Then he went back to work. Zoe knew something was happening. She didn't know what, specifically. She knew her father was working on something at the kitchen table every night after she went to bed. She could tell, by the way the mechanical pencil sounded different from his regular writing, the way he held his shoulders when math was happening versus when he was just reading. She had catalogued these differences over years of living in close proximity to a man who thought loudly without making much sound. She drew him at the kitchen table one afternoon at school. His father at the table, his thinking look on, a large yellow star above his head that she'd added because she felt it was accurate even if invisible. The teacher sent it home in her backpack with a note that said, "Zoe has such a vivid inner world," which Zoe had read over her father's shoulder and then said, "She means I see things other people miss." Darnell had looked at his daughter for a moment and then said he thought that was probably right. He put the picture on the refrigerator. On a Thursday evening in the second week, Zoe looked up from her own work at the kitchen table. She was trying to add a second character to her game, a small figure that followed sparks at a distance, and the pathfinding logic was giving her trouble and said, "What happens if you get it wrong?" He looked at her. "Get what wrong? Whatever you're doing." She nodded at the papers in front of him. "The serious stuff. Then I learn what I did wrong and I try again." She absorbed this. "That's the same as debugging," she returned to her screen. "I've rewritten this pathfinding function 4 times. Each time it's less wrong." A pause. Sparks's friend is going to follow her perfectly eventually. "I just have to keep being wrong in smaller ways until I'm right." He looked at his daughter for a moment longer than the conversation required. 9 years old, and she had arrived at iterative refinement, independently through the process of building something she cared about. He did not know if he had taught her this or if she'd arrived with it, the way she'd arrived with Diane's cheekbones and her own inexplicable certainty about most things. He went back to the papers. Later that same night, after she was asleep, he sat at the table with the composition notebook open and not writing in it. Just sitting. The apartment was the particular quiet of a place where one person is awake and one is asleep, and the one who is awake is aware of both states simultaneously. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, beside Zoe's drawing Diane, not looking at the camera, laughing at something outside the frame the way she always was, the way she'd been laughing at something outside the frame when he took this picture in Boston 6 years before she got sick, and he'd asked her what was funny, and she'd said, "Just the whole thing, Darnell, the whole ridiculous, beautiful thing." He thought about that, about what the whole thing looked like from where he was sitting right now. a kitchen table in Atlanta, a composition notebook, 3 sealed tests already graded by a man who didn't know his name yet, a blue badge in the pocket of his other shirt, a 9-year-old asleep in the next room teaching herself pathfinding algorithms at the same age he'd started teaching himself to code. He closed the notebook, went to bed, slept better than he had in 2 weeks. The Tuesday of the 3rd week, Gary Young called Lorraine into his office. His office was smaller than hers and less organized and contained. On the wall behind his desk, a framed photograph of the original 2-server rack from the Decatur apartment, the actual physical servers they'd run their first system on, photographed before they were decommissioned. He kept it there not as nostalgia, but as a calibration device. Look at where we started. Remember what we're actually doing here. Remember that the work came before the building. Gary was 54 and had been in this industry long enough to have watched 3 full cycles of people decide they had finally determined what intelligence looked like. Every cycle, the definition narrowed to match the profile of the people already in the room. Every cycle, people who didn't match that profile got moved to different rooms. He had opinions about this that he generally kept to himself because Lorraine ran the company and Lorraine was usually right. And the one time he'd pushed back loudly on a personnel decision, he'd spent 2 months regretting the approach, even though he'd been correct on the substance. Today he was not going to make that mistake. He was going to let the numbers do the talking and stay quiet himself. He opened the folder across the desk between them. Part 1. Systems Architecture. Score is in the top quartile of engineers we've assessed at the senior level. He caught both embedded assumptions in Section 4 and flagged them explicitly, which most candidates don't bother doing. They answer around the assumptions instead of naming them. Lorraine looked at the page, said nothing. Part 2. Applied Machine Learning. He took longer on Section 3, but his working notes, Gary tapped the pages where pencil marks ran along the margins, show he was deriving 2 notation conventions from context before proceeding. He didn't guess. He reasoned backward to ground truth and then answered. That's not a junior instinct. That's what people do when they've been solving problems alone for a long time without anyone to ask. She turned the page. Part 3. Gary paused, not for effect, because what he was about to say still surprised him a little, and he'd had 2 days to sit with it. He didn't answer the design question the way the rubric expected. He redesigned the system, eliminated 3 steps. His version runs cleaner, and the dependency chain is simpler. He looked up. I sent it to Angela Thomas on Sunday. Didn't tell her where it came from. Asked if it was viable. She said, and I'm quoting her exactly, "This is actually how we should have built the original." The office was quiet. The framed server rack on the wall. The October light going flat and gray through the window to behind Gary's head. He passed all 3. Gary closed the folder. And Lorraine, I need you to hear this clearly. If this name had come off a resume from a Georgia Tech career fair, we would have been in a bidding war by now. The only reason we're having this conversation instead of an offer letter conversation is the order in which we encountered him. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she picked up the folder. Set up a meeting. Today if possible. Already did. 2 o'clock she stood. And Gary, the blind grading protocol, no name on the envelope, rubric scored before identity revealed. I want that formalized, not just for this. As standard process going forward, Gary looked at her for a moment with the expression he got when something he'd been thinking about for a long time was finally being said by someone else. I have a slide deck I built 3 years ago on exactly that subject. Never showed it to you. She stopped at the door. Why not? Because you weren't ready to hear it yet. The system was working well enough that the cost of changing it felt higher than the cost of keeping it. He held her gaze. It's not working well enough anymore. She nodded once. Went to prepare for the 2 o'clock. Darnell came to the meeting in the same button-down shirt he'd worn to the demo morning. He didn't own a blazer. He'd considered buying one, and then decided that Buying a blazer to prove he belonged somewhere was exactly the kind of logic he didn't want to operate on. He showed up as himself. If that wasn't what the room required, better to know early. Gary was there, which surprised him. He'd expected only Lorraine. Gary stood and extended his hand first, which surprised him more. Gary's handshake was the handshake of a man who has built things with his hands and remembers it. Lorraine didn't do preamble. You passed all 3 tests. Part 3 at a level above the rubric expected. She set the folder on the table. Lead technical consultant. Reporting to me and Gary. Compensation is on page 2. She slid the folder across. Read it here or take it home. He opened it. Read the number on page 2. He'd been about to say that's not necessary, and he recognized even as the words formed that this was the thing a person said when they'd spent so long not expecting to be valued that being valued felt like an accounting error someone needed to correct before it caused problems. He did not say it. He looked at the number again. Thought about Patricia Johnson downstairs and what it would mean to pay her a real rate for the hours she'd given him over 6 years. Thought about Zoe's composition notebook, which was the cheap kind from the pharmacy, and whether she'd notice if he replaced it with the kind that had better paper. Thought about the MIT extension program for alumni re-entry that he'd bookmarked 11 months ago and not opened since, and whether bookmarking something you haven't opened in 11 months constitutes hope or just the memory of hope. One condition, Lorraine said. He looked up. You keep your access to 18. Full building clearance stays. Not because we need you to clean anything. Because I want you to be able to move through this building without asking permission. She held his gaze. People who see clearly tend to see better when they're not confined to a single sightline. He thought about that for a moment. What about Terry's crew? Terry knows. He's not losing a position. You're being moved to a different one. He nodded slowly, picked up the pen from the table and signed on the indicated line and slid the folder back. Gary clapped him once on the shoulder on the way out. Not performative, the acknowledgement of one person to another that something real had just occurred and both of them knew it. Darnell took the stairs back down, not because the elevator was slow, because he needed the 18 floors to let the reality of the last 3 minutes settle into something he could actually carry without dropping it. He called Patricia Johnson from the parking garage. I need to tell you something and I need you to let me get through it before you respond. A pause. Then Patricia's voice, careful and warm in the way she'd been careful and warm with him for 6 years. Go ahead, baby, he told her. Not everything, the compressed version, the whiteboard, and the tests and the meeting and the number on page 2. It took 4 minutes, another pause. Then, are you telling me they hired you to do the math? That's one way to put it, Darnell Cooper. Her voice did something complicated that was either an attempt not to cry or an attempt not to shout, and was probably both simultaneously. Diane would be, she stopped, started differently. You need to go get Zoe and tell her, I know, and bring that child some real pizza tonight. Not the frozen kind, I will. And don't you go in early. You take tonight. He looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage. The fluorescent light above the elevator that flickered whenever a car came in too fast. The absolute ordinariness of everything around him in the moment when something large had changed. I already called Terry, he said. I'm off the rotation until Monday. Patricia made a sound somewhere between approval and benediction. Then the line went quiet, and he heard her, just barely, say something that wasn't directed at him. Something that sounded like, Diane, you see your man? He sat in his car for another minute. Then he drove to get Zoe. She was in the after-school program's back room when he arrived, sitting at a table with 2 other kids, all 3 of them looking at something on a tablet. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, looked at his face, stood up without saying goodbye to the other kids, which was unusual. Zoe had very specific social protocols about proper exits. Something happened, she said. Good something, she processed that. How good? Scale of 1 to 10? Yeah, 11. She stared at him for 3 full seconds. Then she walked over and took his hand and said, "Tell me in the car. I want to be sitting down." He told her in the car. She listened without interrupting, which was also unusual. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out the passenger window at the Atlanta streets going past. "So now you use your brain at work," she said. "Yeah. Like you do at the table at night, like that. Except they pay me for it." She turned and looked at him. 9 years old, with Diane's cheekbones and her own assessment. "They should have been paying you all along." He looked at the road. "Yeah, but they didn't know." "No," she turned back to the window. "We should get pizza," she said. "Patricia said you'd say the frozen kind, but I'm telling you right now, I want the real kind." He laughed a real laugh. "The kind that starts in the chest." "How do you know what Patricia said?" "Because I know Patricia." She pulled her seatbelt straighter. "She's not wrong." What he did not know, in those first days after the appointment, was that the building had already started talking. Not loudly, not in the way of open confrontation or declared positions. The building talked the way institutions talk when something irregular enters the system in the register of adjustment. The small calibrations that happen below the level of policy. Email threads that had included his name last week didn't include it this week. A Monday morning team check-in moved from the 18th floor to the 16th, and the calendar update didn't reach his calendar. A request he'd made for access to a specific simulation archive came back from IT with a note saying permissions were pending approval, which was technically true, because the approval pathway for his new role hadn't been formalized, which was also true, but the formalization had not been prioritized. None of it required intent. That was the thing about systems. They didn't need a villain. They didn't need people. They needed only people who were more comfortable with the shape of the world as it had been than with the shape it was becoming. And comfort expressed itself through small acts of maintenance that collectively added up to exclusion. He noticed. He didn't react. Not because he wasn't bothered, he was. In the way of a man who has learned to metabolize frustration by routing it directly into work. He asked questions through correct channels and waited for answers. And in the meantime kept moving. On a Wednesday evening in his second week in the new role, he was in the break room on 18 at 11 p.m. The old shift schedule still lived in his body, and the break room at that hour was quiet and useful, reading through a simulation report on his laptop. When Victor Bryant walked in, Victor went to the coffee maker. Poured without looking at Darnell. Victor did most things without signaling awareness of the surrounding environment. Then he said, without turning, "The temporal window approach in your last report. Cyclical dataset separation. What about it?" Victor turned, mug in hand. He looked at Darnell directly, which he did rarely enough that the directness felt deliberate. "I ran a preliminary this afternoon. Results were better than I expected." Darnell waited. "I don't agree with how you got here." Victor's voice was flat, not cruel. Just honest in the unadorned way of a man who considers softening language to be a form of inaccuracy. "That's a separate conversation, but I'm not going to treat the numbers as wrong because I don't like the story that produced them." Darnell looked at him. "I'm not asking you to like the story." "Good." Victor looked at his coffee. "Full validation runs Thursday. I'll send you the output." He left. Darnell looked at the door for a moment. That was not warmth. That was something narrower and more durable, a man deciding the work was more important than his discomfort with who was doing it. Not generosity, professional honesty, which, in Darnell's experience, was considerably rarer. The letter arrived that Thursday. Zoe made it herself. This was established later, and with some difficulty, because Zoe initially denied involvement, on the grounds that she wasn't sure it was appropriate, and hadn't decided yet whether to be embarrassed about it. She had a piece of purple construction paper, a set of markers she kept in a coffee can by her desk, and an idea she'd arrived at independently. One afternoon, while Darnell was in a meeting on the 18th floor, and she was at Patricia Johnson's kitchen table, doing homework, Patricia had offered to mail it. Zoe had insisted on hand delivery. by which she meant Patricia would bring it to Mercer Apex's front desk, because Zoe had a theory that handwritten physical letters carried different weight than anything transmitted electronically. This was a theory she'd gotten from her father, who had mentioned it once in passing, and apparently not realized he was establishing a principle. The front desk brought it up to Lorraine's assistant, who set it on the corner of Lorraine's desk, with a look that was professionally neutral and privately uncertain about the correct protocol for hand-delivered crayon correspondence addressed to the CEO. Lorraine found it at 5:40 p.m. when the last call of her day had ended, and she was alone in her office, with the Atlanta evening going gold outside the window. The envelope was purple. Her name was written on the front in careful block letters that had been retraced for emphasis. To MS, Lorraine. Inside, purple construction paper folded once. A drawing, a woman with a black suit and hair up, standing beside a man holding a notebook. Both figures smiled with large curved mouths. Above them, hand-printed stars. Below, in the careful, slow handwriting of a child who was working hard and knew it. Thank you for letting my dad use his brain at work. He hums when he does math. He hasn't hummed in a long time. Now he does again. Zoe, age 9. Lorraine read it, then read it again. She was still holding it when she became aware that she'd walked out of her office and down the hall, and was now sitting on the bench near the elevator bank, beside the potted plant that nobody watered enough. Her heels were off. She didn't remember taking them off. The construction paper was in her hand, and the hallway was empty because it was 5:45 and the floor had been clearing out for an hour. She had a list of things she didn't do in professional spaces. It was detailed, and it had served her well for a long time. But the list had not accounted for a 9-year-old's letter about humming. He hums when he does math. He hasn't hummed in a long time. She sat there for 11 minutes. Alone with the potted plant and the elevator hum, and something she hadn't felt in long enough that she wasn't immediately sure what to call it. Not grief, exactly. Not longing. More like the sensation of recognizing something you'd set down so long ago, you'd stopped noticing its absence, and suddenly here it was, handed back to you by a child in a drawing with stars. She thought about her grandmother, Catherine, who had hummed while she worked, while making breakfast, while doing night shift notes, while sitting in her chair watching the evening news with the sound low. Catherine had said once, when Lorraine was 14, and not paying the kind of attention she would later wish she had, "A person who hums is a person who is still themselves, baby. When the humming stops, that's when you start worrying." Lorraine had been 14. She had nodded and not understood and moved on to something else. She understood it now, sitting in a hallway in Midtown Atlanta at 5:45 in the evening, with purple construction paper in her hands and her shoes off. She sat there until the hallway lights clicked to their night, setting lower, warmer. Then she put her shoes back on. She walked back to her office. She picked up her phone and made a call she had been putting off for 9 months. Her cousin Wendell answered on the second ring. Surprised. Pleased in the way that tells you immediately how long the silence has been and what it cost. They talked for 51 minutes. About nothing consequential: his youngest daughter's soccer season, a restaurant that had opened near his house, an ongoing debate about whether sweet potato pie qualified as a vegetable in sufficient quantities. Lorraine laughed 3 times, genuinely, in ways that required no calculation. When she hung up, the office was dark except for her desk lamp. She opened her laptop and sent Gary a message. "We need to talk about how we evaluate people. Not Darnell specifically. The system itself. Monday. Whenever you're in." Gary's response came back in 4 minutes, which meant he was still at his desk. "Already have a slide deck I built 3 years ago and never showed you. See you Monday." She stared at that, typed back, "Why didn't you show me?" "Because you weren't ready to hear it. Now you are." She turned off the lamp, left the office. In the elevator down to the parking level, she looked at her reflection in the steel doors, her face less managed than usual, something in it she didn't immediately recognize, but decided not to analyze tonight. Some things arrived before you were ready to name them. She drove home, made tea, went to sleep before midnight for the first time in 2 weeks, which was its own kind of evidence. The article appeared on a Friday morning at 7:18 a.m., a mid-tier Atlanta tech blog. Not large, not small, exactly large enough that 2 board members had texted it to Lorraine before she'd finished her first coffee. Mercer Apex's new consultant. Janitor or genius? Inside the unconventional hire-raising questions. About the company's direction. The facts were accurate. The framing was not inaccurate. So much as precisely shaped to generate unease, the kind of article that doesn't accuse anyone of anything, but loads every sentence with the suggestion that the reader should feel suspicious. It quoted an anonymous source inside the organization who expressed concern about the rigor of recent personnel decisions. It mentioned twice that Darnell's previous role had been custodial. Lorraine read it in her car in the parking structure. "Read it again," called Gary. "I saw it." Gary's voice was measured but had something underneath it. Someone inside. Narrow field, given what's in there. "I know." "What do you want to do?" "Nothing public. This week I want Angela's validation on the temporal window, the Q3 accuracy benchmarks, the committee feedback from the federal demo. Everything documented and organized before Monday's board call, already started. And Gary, find out who takes this to board level before Scott Hill does. Already in progress." She hung up, went upstairs. Darnell read the article while walking Zoe to school. Not ideal timing. The push notification had appeared, and his thumb had done what thumbs do. And suddenly he was reading while Zoe narrated a dream she'd had, about finding a logic error in a maze that turned out to be a metaphor for something she hadn't figured out yet. He read it without stopping walking, without his face changing in any way he was aware of. He put the phone away when the school gate came into view. Zoe stopped at the gate. "What happened?" "Nothing important, Dad." The word had weight. She'd started doing that, loading single words with entire arguments. "What happened?" He looked down at her, 9 years old, already keeping her own composition notebook. "Someone wrote something about me that frames the truth in an unfair way." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to actual problems. "Did you do anything wrong?" "No." "Then the truth is still the truth. The framing is their problem, not yours." She shifted her backpack. Sparks's friend had a bug where she looked like she was walking backwards when she wasn't. It was a display error, not a movement error. "I fixed the display." She looked at him steadily. "Fix the display." He watched her walk through the gate. Total forward momentum, zero self-consciousness. The ground glad to have her on it. He drove to Mercer Apex. Scott Hill called an emergency board session for that Wednesday. He was 58, investment background, held 18% of the company. He wore a watch that cost more than Darnell's car. He was not cruel. He was a man who had spent 30 years measuring risk, and who had looked at the article and measured this as risk. The room, 5 board members, Gary, Lorraine. Long table, expensive chairs. Afternoon light making everything look more authoritative than it needed to be. Scott set the article on the table. Didn't gesture at it. "Let it sit. I want to understand the process," he began. "Not the outcome, how we evaluate people, how we make decisions about senior roles. What I'm reading suggests the story got ahead of the decision." Lorraine looked at him steadily. "The decision came first. The story is 2 weeks behind it." "Lorraine." He took 3 assessment tests. Scored at senior level on 2, above rubric on the 3rd. She placed Gary's folder on the table. Gary administered them blind. He did not know the candidate's name until after scoring was complete. Documented on page 1, Scott looked at the folder, did not open it. "My concern isn't whether he's capable," Scott said. "My concern is that we have a $180 million federal relationship and a Series C in progress, and a story in the press framing this company as making emotional decisions." Lorraine's voice didn't shift. "Which part of a blind-graded technical assessment is emotional, Scott?" A board member at the far end of the table adjusted in his chair. Gary spoke from his seat. his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has decided to say one thing and say it correctly. The third test had a genuine design flaw embedded in the system specification. Not a planted trick, an actual flaw. Darnell Cooper redesigned the system from component level up. His version is cleaner and runs faster. Angela Thomas, who had no knowledge of who submitted the test, reviewed it and said it's how we should have built the original. He looked around the table. We can debate the story. I'm not going to debate the work. Scott sat with that. He was a man who understood numbers at a cellular level. This was the truth about him, underneath the risk calculations. And the number Gary had just put on the table was not disputable by anyone in the room who was being honest. What's the plan for the press? He said finally. Lorraine, nothing public. Excellent work over the coming weeks. The work is its own argument, and if it surfaces in the Series C conversations, then we show the investors what's already been built. And we'd let them decide whether they'd rather fund a company that found excellence in an unexpected place, or one that required it to arrive pre-packaged in the correct container. The room was quiet. Scott picked up the folder, opened it, read the first page, then the third, then the section Gary had marked showing Darnell's redesign of the third test. He read for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he closed the folder and pushed it back toward the center of the table. I'm not blocking the appointment. I want quarterly technical outcome reviews. Documented. He stood. That's all I needed. He left. The door closed. Lorraine looked at Gary across the full length of the table. Gary looked back. Neither said anything, which was the privilege of 12 years of building something together, the ability to have a conversation without sound and understand it completely. The week after the board meeting, Victor sent the temporal window validation results. Darnell opened the email on a Thursday afternoon and read the numbers twice. The improvement was 23% over the existing model, better than his preliminary had suggested. Not because he'd been wrong about the direction, but because Angela had refined the implementation in ways he hadn't anticipated. She'd added a calibration layer that smoothed variance at the edges of each window, a solution that was more elegant than what he would have built, and that made the entire architecture significantly more robust. She had taken his structure and improved it. That was how good work was supposed to move, he replied. Angela's calibration layer is the reason this performs at this level. Her name should be first on the write-up. 3 minutes later, Angela replied, which she didn't usually do directly. Victor already flagged it that way. Your name's in the second line. Hope that's okay. He looked at that for a moment, thought about a man who had opposed him in that conference room 3 weeks ago, and had quietly, without announcement, made sure credit landed where it belonged. More than okay, he typed back. He closed the laptop and sat in his corner office, a small room on 18, one window facing east, and let the afternoon settle. There was a satisfaction in this that he hadn't named yet, because naming it still felt presumptuous. Not triumph, not even pride. More like the sensation of a thing that had been open for a long time beginning, slowly and without ceremony, to close. He called Patricia at 4:30. Is that good? She said, after he told her about the numbers. It's very good. Does it mean they stopped trying to edge you out? He laughed, a real one. I don't know, but it makes it considerably harder. Good. A pause. Zoe made you something today, by the way. You're on a rocket. Why a rocket? I asked her. She said, because you finally have the right fuel. Patricia's voice softened. She's right, you know. He sat with that. A 9-year-old's theory of combustion applied to her father's life. Not wrong. Actually, not wrong at all. The invitation from Lorraine came on a Monday morning, not a calendar block. Not a meeting request with an agenda, a text, 8:14 a.m. The annual investor summit is 6 weeks out. I'd like you to present. Not a panel. Not a secondary slot. Main stage. 20 minutes. Your story and what you've built. No script, no handler. Nothing prepared except what you already know. He read it at the kitchen table. Zoe was eating cereal across from him, watching his face with the alertness she showed whenever it did something worth cataloging. "What is it?" He set the phone down. "Big thing. Good big or complicated big?" "Both," she nodded, returning to her cereal. "Those are the ones that matter," she said to the bowl. Sparks's hardest levels are always both. He picked up the phone. The cursor ready, he typed, "I'll do it. One condition. No teleprompter, no one in my ear. No version of me that isn't the version that showed up with a mop." The response came back in under a minute. "Agreed. Be the version that saw what we missed." That's the one they need to hear from. He set the phone down. 6 weeks. 6.5 years since Diane. 9 years since he'd left Boston with a car seat in the back and a daughter and a grief he didn't yet know the full dimensions of. 6 years of kitchen table mathematics done in the hours between Zoe's bedtime and his own, with a composition notebook and a mechanical pencil, and no audience and no payoff except the private satisfaction of still being himself. 6 weeks. He got up and walked Zoe to school. That night, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table, with the notebook closed in front of him, just sitting. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator, Diane, not looking at the camera, laughing at something past the frame. Just the whole thing, Darnell. The whole ridiculous, beautiful thing. He thought about standing on a stage in 6 weeks in front of 500 people, with the particular armor that comes from being in rooms where everyone else is also armored. He thought about what he had to say to those people, and whether any version of the truth he carried would survive that air. He thought about the whiteboard, the red marker, 16 minutes in a room where nobody expected him to do anything except straighten the chairs. He opened the composition notebook. He didn't write a speech, he wrote a question, the same one he'd been carrying without fully articulating for 9 years. What does it cost to make someone invisible, and who pays that cost? He stared at the question for a while. Then he closed the notebook and turned off the kitchen light. For the first time in longer than he could precisely name, he went to sleep before midnight without setting an alarm. The morning was going to come regardless. Some things didn't need to be managed. They just needed to be walked toward. 6 weeks is not a long time, unless you're preparing to stand in front of 500 people who measure the world in quarterly returns, and tell them something they didn't come to hear. Then 6 weeks is approximately 4 weeks too short and 2 weeks too long. Too short because nothing feels ready. Too long because everything that isn't ready just sits there, watching you from across the kitchen table every night after your daughter goes to sleep. Darnell didn't write a speech. He'd decided that early and held to it. A speech was a performance of someone who had prepared to seem natural, which was the exact opposite of what Lorraine had asked for, and the exact opposite of what he actually was. He knew how to talk. He'd been talking to Zoe about complicated things in simple language since she was old enough to ask questions, which was approximately from the moment she could form sentences. He knew how to make a thing land. What he didn't know was whether a room full of people who had spent their careers being addressed by other people exactly like themselves would have the receptors for the frequency he was going to broadcast on. That question he couldn't solve in advance. So he stopped trying to solve it and started doing what he always did when a problem resisted direct approach. He worked on the thing next to it and let the original problem come into focus on its own. What he did instead, in the 6 weeks between Lorraine's text and the summit, was work. Not because work was an escape, because the work was the argument. Every result Angela's team produced using the temporal window model was another sentence in a case that didn't need him to make it. Every validation report Victor sent, and Victor sent them with increasing regularity now, with a precision that suggested he had made a decision privately and was expressing it through data rather than conversations, was another line of evidence that the article in that tech blog had gotten the sequence wrong. The story said the hire was a risk. The numbers said the hire had already paid out. Numbers didn't need a spokesperson. He understood something about Victor Bryant during those 6 weeks that he hadn't fully understood before. Victor wasn't protecting himself. He was protecting a system. He'd built his professional identity inside of a system with a specific grammar, specific credentials and processes and stages that meant something had been earned in a legible way. When Darnell had arrived at a conclusion Victor hadn't reached, he hadn't just solved a problem. He'd made a claim on that system's territory without using the system's language. And Victor, being the man he was, had experienced that not as help but as a challenge to the integrity of the whole structure, which was understandable, which didn't make it right. But understanding the difference between understandable and right was how Darnell had survived 9 years of being in rooms where he was not expected, and understanding it without bitterness was how he intended to keep surviving. The conversation that shifted things happened on a Thursday evening in the break room on 18. Third week of the 6. Victor came in late, which was his habit, and poured coffee from the machine he'd complained about for 2 years and kept using anyway. Darnell was at the table with his laptop and a bag of pretzels he'd been working through slowly. Victor poured his coffee, turned, looked at Darnell with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing something and has arrived at the moment to say it. "I owe you something." His voice was flat, not apologetic in the performative sense, just accurate. Not an apology exactly. "I don't think I was wrong to want process. But I was wrong about what your being here means." Darnell looked at him. "What does it mean?" Victor considered the question the way he considered all questions seriously, from multiple angles, without hurrying toward an answer that would let him stop thinking. "It means there are people like you everywhere, seeing things. And we've built the intake system so that it only finds them if they're holding the right piece of tape when they arrive." He looked at his coffee. "That's a design flaw. Same category as the node problem. Same kind of error looks structural until you examine the actual dependencies and realize the assumption was always wrong." Darnell was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do something about it?" "Already sent a proposal to Gary. Blind assessment program, any internal referral, anonymous submission, comes through the same rubric we gave you. Before identity is revealed," he looked up, "I used your test results as the calibration baseline. Wanted you to know before you heard it another way. It was, in fact, far more than Darnell had expected. But he didn't say that. He said, put Angela's name on the proposal as co-author. The calibration layer she built is what makes the window model scale. She'll be the one who has to implement whatever process you're recommending, and her credibility behind it matters more than mine right now." Victor looked at him for a second with something that existed in the space between respect and its absence, the space where people who have disagreed seriously and honestly sometimes end up, which is not a comfortable space but is a real one. "Already done," he said. He took his coffee, left. Darnell sat with the pretzels and the laptop and the quiet 18th floor and thought about the way things change when they change for real. Not with declarations. Not with formal ceremonies. In a break room at 11 p.m., over bad machine coffee, and a conversation that took less than 3 minutes and moved something that had been fixed in one position for a very long time. Lorraine drove past her house on a Sunday night, not stopped at it. Past it. She was coming back from a working dinner in Buckhead with a potential Series C investor, a woman named Denise Warren, partner at a Chicago infrastructure fund, who asked sharp questions and wrote things in her notebook at moments that suggested she was registering something beyond the surface of what was being said. Lorraine had answered the questions about the federal contract directly and without management. When Lorraine mentioned the temporal window model and who had developed it, Denise Warren had set her pen down and said, "Tell me that again, slower." Lorraine had told it again. Denise Warren had written something in her notebook and said, "That's the best talent acquisition story I've heard this year. It needs to be in the deck." So the dinner had gone well. And Lorraine was driving home through a Sunday night Atlanta that was quieter than its weekday self. And she had the particular satisfaction that came from a good meeting, which was a familiar feeling, except that tonight it had something else underneath it. That she was still triangulating. She drove past her building without registering it. Got 3 blocks down before she noticed. Stopped at a red light. Sat there while the city did what it did. She had been thinking about Catherine, not for the first time in recent weeks. Since the evening with Zoe's letter, she had been thinking about her grandmother more directly than she had allowed herself to, in the 9 months since the funeral. 9 months during which she had managed the grief the way she managed most things, by scheduling it into defined windows, and then moving it to the following week when those windows filled with other items. Catherine had worked 34 years as a nurse at a hospital in Jacksonville and had never once complained about the work itself, only about the people who treated the work she did as less meaningful because it happened close to the floor, in the rooms where bodies and not policies were the primary reality. Catherine had said something once, during Lorraine's junior year of college, when she'd called home electric, with the energy of someone who had just been in a room with important people and found it intoxicating. "Baby, I need you to hold on to something. The person who is most essential in any situation is almost always the one that everyone walks past on their way to ask someone else for help." Lorraine had been 21. She had filed it under grandmother wisdom and moved on to whatever was happening next. She thought about it now, at a red light in Midtown Atlanta on a Sunday night, and understood it in a way she hadn't. At 21 understood it, not as an observation about other people, but as a description of what she had spent 12 years building an organization that did. The light changed. She drove home. She did not go to the laptop or the email or the investor deck she was supposed to review before Monday. She made tea. She sat in a chair that wasn't her desk chair, which she didn't do often enough for it to feel natural. She looked out at the Atlanta night and let the day arrive at what it actually was. Then she called Darnell. Not to talk about the summit, not to talk about the model or the Series Cs, or the board, or any of the machinery that had structured most of their conversations over the past weeks. She called because Zoe's letter was still folded in the inside pocket of the coat she wore on Wednesdays, and she thought he should know that. He answered on the second ring. The television in the background, very low, the ambient sound of a household winding down. "Is she asleep?" Lorraine asked. "About 20 minutes ago." A pause. She resisted. She always resists, every single night. She treats it like an argument she expects to win eventually. Another pause. Carrying a different quality warmer, the way his voice went when he talked about Zoe without trying to. "This week, she informed me that sleep is just your brain filing things away, and she doesn't see why it has to happen in the dark lying down." Lorraine made a sound that was entirely involuntary. "She's 9, I know. She has opinions about the design." She turned the tea mug in her hands. The city outside her window, lights stacked up against the dark. "I still have the letter. Zoe's letter. The one she brought to the office. A beat. I didn't know she did that until after. I know you didn't. That's partly why I kept it." She looked at the window. "She said you hum when you do math. That you hadn't hummed in a long time and now you do again." Silence on his end. "The receiving kind, not the processing kind, do you?" she asked. I didn't know anyone could hear it. Zoe hears everything." Another silence. Then quietly, "I didn't know I'd stopped until she said I'd started again." Lorraine set the tea mug down. This was the thing about Darnell Cooper that she had not anticipated and had been sitting with for weeks now. He was honest in a way that wasn't a performance of honesty. Not strategy, not self-presentation, just what remained after years of not having an audience to perform for. And being near that kind of honesty was disorienting in a specific way. It made the managed version of herself feel less like protection and more like a coat she'd been wearing so long. She'd forgotten it wasn't her skin. "I called my cousin Wendell last month," she said. "For the first time since my grandmother's funeral." "How was it?" 51 minutes about nothing. It was the best conversation I'd had all year. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she would have liked that. Your grandmother. Lorraine paused. You don't know that. I know she raised you and you're still you underneath everything. Someone did something right. A pause. That tends to be who did it. She sat with that for longer than she would have been comfortable with in a room with anyone else. You say things that are just exactly accurate, she said finally. It's slightly aggravating. I've heard that before. From who? Zoe mostly, Patricia occasionally, a beat. It's a short list, Lorraine smiled, alone in her apartment in the dark, smiling at her phone, which was fine, which was something she was going to let be what it was, without putting it through analysis. Because she had done enough analyzing of things for one day, and the tea was getting cold and Darnell had an early morning. Get some sleep, she said. You too. And Lorraine, a beat, thank you for keeping it. She didn't have to ask what he meant. She already knew, which was its own kind of information. The night before the summit, Nets sat in the kitchen and did not prepare. Zoe's cereal bowls were in the drying rack. Her backpack was on the hook by the door, packed for the next day by Patricia, who was doing drop-off in the morning because Darnell needed to be at the convention center by 8. The apartment was the way it always was, full of the evidence of a life being lived with too much to do and not quite enough space, and also, always, enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough Zoe. Those three things had always been true, and Darnell had learned not to take any of them for granted. He looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. Diane, not looking at the camera, laughing at something outside the frame that only she could see. He'd taken this picture in Boston in October outside the library, and when he'd asked her later what was funny, she'd said, "Just the whole thing, Darnell. The whole ridiculous, beautiful thing." He had not fully understood what she meant until the last few months, and now he understood it the way you understand things. You learn too late completely, and with a kind of ache that was also its own form of gratitude. He thought about standing on a stage tomorrow in front of 500 people who had built careers on the premise that value announced itself in legible ways. He thought about what he had to say and whether any version of the truth he carried would survive that room. Then he stopped thinking about it, because the thinking wasn't the point. The point was that he had something true to say. He had carried it in composition notebooks and kitchen tables and late nights with one earbud in and one ear always available for Zoe. It wasn't a speech, it was a life. You don't prepare a life. You just stand in it and let it speak. His phone buzzed. Lorraine, how are you feeling? He looked at the message for a moment, then typed, like I have something true to say to a room that didn't know it needed to hear it. A long pause. Then, that's exactly right. See you tomorrow. He set the phone face down on the table, sat in the kitchen for a few more minutes. Then he went to bed, slept until 5:30, made Zoe's breakfast, sat with her while she ate and listened to her explain in careful detail the latest developments in Sparks's companion character. The pathfinding logic was now working correctly, and the companion had been named Ember, which Zoe felt was both thematically appropriate and technically descriptive since the character left small marks where she walked. He hugged her at the door. She held on for a count of 7. You're going to be so good, she said into his shoulder. I might be nervous. She pulled back, looked at him with Diane's eyes carrying her own certainty. Being nervous means you understand what's at stake. That's not a problem. That's information. She straightened his collar, which didn't need straightening, but she did it anyway. Go, he went. The Atlanta Convention Center held 500 people comfortably and perhaps 600 if you were optimistic about personal space. Today sat somewhere in between. Investors, strategic partners, federal liaisons, a row of journalists near the back carrying the specific attentiveness of people who had been disappointed by too many of these events and weren't committing to engagement until something earned it. Lorraine opened the summit at 9. She moved through the year's technical milestones with the precision that had always been her gift, the ability to complex things that were legible to people. who needed to trust what they couldn't fully understand. She covered the federal contract outcomes, the Series C progress, the expansion into 4 new metro areas. She spoke for 22 minutes and the room stayed with her for all of them. And then she stopped. Not a pause for effect, an actual stop. The room felt it, the difference between a speaker collecting herself and a speaker who has arrived at something that requires a different gear. Before I hand off to the technical team, she said, I want to tell you something about how we got here. Not the how of contracts and timelines, the how of a Tuesday night and a whiteboard and a decision that could have gone another way. She looked around the room without hurry. 8 weeks ago, a man named Darnell Cooper walked into a conference room on the 18th floor of this building at 11:17 p.m. with a cleaning cart and a key card, and saw something that 11 engineers had missed across 9 months of work. She let that land. He corrected it with a red marker in under 5 minutes, and then he finished cleaning the room and went home. A pause. I'd like him to tell you what he saw, not the algorithm, what he actually saw. Darnell. The room turned. Darnell walked out from the left side of the stage, no slides loaded behind him, no notes in hand. He took the microphone from the stand and held it at his side for a moment. While the room settled into the specific attentiveness of people who have been handed something unexpected and haven't decided yet what to do with it. He was wearing the blue button-down shirt that Zoe had ironed for him that morning, with the focused intensity of someone who understood the stakes and the iron in that order. The result was technically imperfect in ways that were immediately visible. Lorraine, standing in the wings, looked at that shirt and thought it was the most honest piece of clothing she'd seen on any stage in years. He looked at the room, not performing the look, just looking, the way he looked at a whiteboard or a dashboard, taking in what was actually there before deciding what to say about it. I have a daughter, he said. Her name is Zoe. She's 9 years old. This week she told me that being nervous means you understand what's at stake, and that's not a problem. That's information, a beat. The room processed this. Then, it laughed. Not the polite laugh of an audience maintaining social convention, but the genuine laugh of people who had been expecting something formal and received something human, and found the exchange favorable. She also thinks I'm shiny when I'm doing math. He started walking slow, no fixed destination, the way he moved when he was thinking something through. I don't know what shiny looks like from the outside. I know what it feels like from the inside. It feels like the moment before you see something you couldn't see a second ago. When the world adjusts 1 degree and the thing that was invisible is just there, waiting, like it was always going to be there once you stood in the right place. He stopped. I was in a conference room 8 weeks ago because that was my job. Not my job to look at the whiteboard. My job to wipe down the table and empty the bin and get to the next room. Before 4 in the morning, he looked at the floor for a second, then back up. Except I am physically incapable of walking past a math problem that's wrong. I have been since I was 11 years old. It's not a gift, it's more like an allergy. The wrongness gets into my system and I can't breathe correctly until I address it. He walked again. The room was entirely still. Not the polite still of an audience waiting for the point. The other kind. The kind where people stop checking their phones because they've forgotten they have phones. I was a junior at MIT when my wife got sick. I left before my 4th year because my daughter was almost 3 years old, and the math of that situation was the simplest math I've ever done. Stay and have a degree. Leave and have a daughter who has a parent who shows up every day. He paused. Not for the room, for the actual weight of what he was saying. I left. The silence held its shape. For 9 years I worked with my hands and read with whatever was left of my mind at the end of the night. Research papers, documentation, open source code. At the kitchen table after my daughter went to sleep. Not because I thought it was going anywhere, because I am incapable of not doing it. The thinking doesn't have an off switch. It just needed somewhere to go. He stopped again, looked out at 500 faces, And then one night, I walked into the wrong room at the wrong hour and saw the right thing. And I wrote it down. He took a breath. Here is what I actually saw on that whiteboard. His voice shifted, not louder, more specific. A team of brilliant people had built something precise and elegant and made one foundational error. They assumed the thing they were modeling moved in straight lines, because that's the mathematics that's easiest to apply. But the thing they were modeling was human behavior. And human behavior doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in rhythms, patterns that repeat and shift and fold back on themselves. You can't flatten that without losing the truth of it. And when you lose the truth of it in a model, the model eventually walks you somewhere wrong. He looked around slowly. I'm not telling you that story to tell you I'm smart. I'm telling you that story because I need you to understand something about the buildings you go back to. On Monday, he stopped walking, planted his feet. The room felt the change. There are people in those buildings right now who see what I saw, who are carrying the corrective in their heads this moment. And they don't have a key card to the 18th floor, not because they haven't earned one, because the system that decides who gets the key card was built to recognize one kind of proof of value and is blind to every other kind. A pause. The kind that doesn't need to be manufactured because the room creates it. I was the man with the mop. I had the answer. Both of those things were true at the same time, in the same body, on the same Tuesday night. And the question I'm leaving with every person in this room who runs something, who decides who gets in the door is this. What are you doing to make sure those two things can coexist in your building? Because they're out there. They've always been out there. The question is whether you've built a door they can walk through. He was quiet. The woman in the front row stood first, Denise Warren. Red blazer, silver bracelet, the Series C investor who had told Lorraine to put this story in the deck. She began clapping slowly and deliberately, not the reflexive applause of a polite audience, but the intentional applause of a person who has decided that something deserves to be marked. Then the second row. Then the third. Then the room was on its feet. And the sound was not the sound of a performance being acknowledged. It was 500 people recognizing something true that they had not been expecting to encounter today. And finding that the recognition felt like relief, Darnell stood on the stage and let it arrive. He did not deflect it or perform humility by looking away. He stood in it the way Zoe stood in everything, with his whole self, without the armor of self-minimization he had worn for 9 years, like a second uniform. He walked off stage, and Lorraine was there. She was at the edge of the wing, where the curtain met the wall, and her face was doing something he had never seen it do, across all the conference rooms and break rooms and phone calls that had accumulated between them. Not composed, not managed. Just open, the way a face looks when the person behind it has stopped deciding how to appear. You did it, she said. I said what was true. That's what doing it is. He looked at her. She looked at it. She around them. Around them the room was producing the specific sound that follows something that has moved people, not applause anymore, but conversation. The sound of 500 people turning to the person beside them to say, "Did you hear that? Gary's going to want to debrief," Darnell said. "Gary can wait." She didn't move. "Are you all right?" He considered this honestly, the way he always considered things. "I feel like something I've been holding for a long time just got set down." He paused. "Not Diane. Not Zoe. Something else. Something I didn't know I was still carrying until just now, when I wasn't carrying it anymore." Lorraine nodded slowly. She understood that specific thing, the weight that accumulates not from grief, but from diminishment. From years of buildings that decided your value before you opened your mouth and never revisited the decision. "It should have been set down a long time ago," she said. "Maybe. But I'm not sure I could have picked it back up if it had been. Some things you carry until you're strong enough to put them down permanently." Not a day earlier. She looked at him for a long moment. Then Gary was coming through the wing with the specific gait of a man who has been sitting on good news for 10 minutes and has reached the limit of his professional patience. Gary's news was this: the chair of the Federal Review Committee, not Kathleen Robinson, who had led the initial evaluation, but the committee chair who sat above her and had been monitoring the validation results since the contract was signed, had called Lorraine's office during the presentation. The message he'd left was 4 sentences. The last sentence was, "We'd like to discuss expanding the scope of the engagement." Gary delivered this with the controlled excitement of a man who has wanted to say something for 10 minutes and is saying it correctly, because that is who Gary Young is at his best. Lorraine absorbed it. Looked at Darnell. Darnell looked at Gary. The temporal window model, that's what they want to expand. Specifically referenced. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Angela leads that conversation. Her calibration layer is why the model scales. She should own the relationship going forward. Gary looked at him with the expression of a man recalibrating something in real time. "I'll set that up. And Victor's blind assessment proposal, is that moving?" "Board agenda next month." Gary held his gaze steadily. "Between you and me, it's going to pass. Scott Hill read the design document and called me to say it was overdue." Darnell absorbed that without particular expression. Not because he wasn't moved by it. Because some things land in the private register and stay there, and their value isn't diminished by staying quiet. The formal appointment came in writing 3 days later. Leadership team. His name in the quarterly report. A proper office on 18, not the corner room, but a room with 2 east-facing windows and a whiteboard that caught the morning light. He stood in the empty office for 10 minutes before putting anything in it. Just stood. The Atlanta skyline through the east window, the whiteboard blank and waiting, the same dry erase marker smell that had been part of every room on this floor for 2 years. He wrote one thing on the whiteboard before unpacking. Not an equation. What does it cost to make someone invisible? And who pays that cost? Then he opened his composition notebook to the next clean page and started working. 4 months later, a Sunday morning in February. Atlanta in February is not cold so much as it is honest about not being warm yet. The trees along the side streets still bare, the light thin and white, the city carrying the specific quality of a place that has decided winter isn't worth dramatizing. Spring would come. It always came. The waiting was just part of the calendar. Darnell had made breakfast, which was to say he had made the eggs he always made, scrambled, overworked, slightly dry at the edges, cooked with attention if not with skill. And Zoe had eaten hers with the diplomatic enthusiasm of someone who understood that the eggs were an act of love, and that love didn't require technical excellence to count. She had cleared her plate and then looked at him with the expression she used when she'd been holding something. "Dad? Yeah. Is Ms. Lorraine coming today?" He looked at her. She looked back. 9 years old, and 3/4 and fully in possession of every piece of information available in their household. She might stop by later. Zoe nodded slowly, the nod of a person who had anticipated this outcome and was pleased to have her model confirmed. "Good, because I want to show her the new thing in Sparks." "What new thing?" Ember learned a trick. She set down her juice box. "There's a room in level 7 that looks like a dead end from the entrance. But if you go all the way to the right wall first, the angle changes, and you can see a door on the left side that was there the whole time." She looked at him with Diane's eyes. "You can only find it if you check the places that look empty." He looked at his daughter, thought about a whiteboard, a red marker, a problem that had been visible from one angle and invisible from another. "Where did you get that idea?" he asked. She shrugged. "Where do you think?" Lorraine arrived at 11:30. She knocked twice. Zoe opened the door with the immediacy of someone who had been within 10 feet of it. "For the past several minutes, I made a new level," Zoe announced by way of greeting. Lorraine came in. She had stopped wearing the full structure of her professional self on Sundays over the past month's coat, yes, but softer. Hair down. The version of herself she was reconstructing from components she'd packed away in her late 20s companies, when the company was requiring everything she had and she had given it, without accounting for what she was drawing down. "Show me," Lorraine said. Zoe led her to the laptop at the kitchen table with the gravity of a person presenting work that had taken real effort and deserved real attention. Darnell handed Lorraine a coffee and stood back, watching his daughter explain the mechanics of the game she'd built from source code she'd first looked at when she was 3 years old to the CEO of an AI company, with the exact same patient precision she used when explaining it to Patricia Johnson's grandchildren. Lorraine leaned in, actually looked. Why can't she go over the wall? Because the wall isn't the problem, Zoe pointed at the screen. There's a door on the left side, but you can only see it if you go all the way to the right first. It looks like there's nothing there. But if you go check anyway, the angle changes and you can see it. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at Darnell over Zoe's head, and her expression held approximately 6 things simultaneously. He raised his coffee cup slightly. Because some things don't need words. Some things you just look at and nod. Nod because the alternative is trying to compress this into a sentence and sense. Something that is far too large for 19 years of kitchen table mathematics. A question written on a whiteboard in an empty office. A girl who found doors by checking the places that looked empty. Life, doing what it does when you don't stop showing up for it. They ate lunch. Lorraine had brought food, real food, requiring actual preparation, which she had been doing with increasing regularity and improving competence. Since making a private decision some months ago to stop treating cooking as an optional activity. The result today was a pasta dish that was technically overcooked in the way of someone still learning, and actually good in the way that things made with care tend to be regardless of technical proficiency. Zoe ate 2 servings and declared it better than the school cafeteria, which Lorraine received as the genuine high praise it was intended to be. After Zoe retreated to the beanbag with her laptop to add detail to the new level. Darnell and Lorraine sat at the cleared kitchen table with coffee and the kind of quiet that had accumulated between them over months of phone calls and late evenings, and the gradual, unannounced process of 2 people deciding each other was worth staying in. Not announced. Not formalized. Just true, in the way things become true when you stop negotiating with them. I have something to tell you, Lorraine said. He waited. Denise Warren called me Thursday. She wants to co-lead the Series C. Lorraine turned her coffee mug in her hands, and she wants to structure a program inside the fund, identifying talent in non-traditional pipelines. Using the blind assessment model as the framework for other portfolio companies, he looked at her. That's significant. Yes, she looked at him directly. She called it the Cooper Protocol in the initial term sheet draft, silence. The kind he needed a moment inside of. Tell her to call it something else, he said. Lorraine tilted her head. Call it the Open Door Program, or the Second Look Initiative. Call it anything that's about the idea and not about me. He looked at the kitchen table. The surface that had held 9 years of midnight mathematics and Zoe's drawings and cereal bowls and grief and composition notebooks and the evidence of a life that had refused to stop thinking even when the world had stopped watching. The point isn't that I'm the exception. The point is that the exception shouldn't exist. The point is that the door should be open. Not for one person. For everyone standing outside it who never knew there was a door at all. Lorraine looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, with the voice she used when she meant something that lived past the words. Catherine would have used that protocol every day she worked. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. From the beanbag, Zoe's marker stopped moving. She'd been listening. Because she always listened, had always listened, to everything said in rooms she was in, and several rooms she was adjacent to. What's a protocol? Lorraine looked at her. A rule for how to do something right. Zoe considered this. Like how you always check the places that look empty, even when it seems like there's nothing there. Exactly like that. Zoe nodded, satisfied, and returned to her level. Lorraine looked at Darnell. He looked back. And then, because 9 years of watching his daughter approach the world had taught him that the moment you want to say something, is almost always the right moment to say it. He reached across the kitchen table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatic, not performed. Just present, the way he was present for the things that mattered. She looked down at his hand, then up at him. "I know this isn't the version of a Sunday morning you spent 12 years building toward," he said. "No." Her voice quiet and certain in the way of someone who has thought about this already, and arrived at the answer before the question was asked. "It's better." He proposed 4 Sundays after that, not with a formal plan. He had been thinking about it for weeks, turning the shape of it over the way he turned problems, not forcing a solution, but staying near it until the right form became visible. And the shape that became visible was this. It needed to involve Zoe, because anything he committed to at this level of his life included Zoe by definition and always had. It needed to involve the dragon game, because the dragon game was the thing he had built from nothing but time and care and a second-hand laptop, and it was therefore the most honest object in his possession. And it needed to happen in the kitchen, because the kitchen was where everything real had always happened in this apartment, and a decision this real deserved its honest setting. He updated one level of Sparks's maze across 3 nights after Zoe went to sleep. Added a new room at the end, simple pixel walls, Sparks at the center, and on the far wall, in the game's small font, a single line of text. The level was ready by Wednesday. The wait until Sunday required a patience he was not entirely certain he had, but managed anyway. Sunday arrived. Zoe opened the game after breakfast with the proprietary confidence of the person who had been most involved in its development. She moved through the existing levels, reached the new one, ride the screen, ride it again, looked up at her father with an expression that was processing at a speed her face couldn't quite keep pace with. "Dad, yeah. What does this mean?" "It means I need Lorraine to press it." Zoe stared at him, then at the screen, then at him. Then she looked at the ceiling, in the way she looked at the ceiling when she was running a calculation, and said, "Okay, but you should know I already knew this was going to happen." He laughed genuinely, the laugh that lived in his chest. "I know you did," he called Lorraine. She drove over. He did not explain in the call. Just said Zoe had something to show her. Lorraine came in, read Zoe's face, and understood immediately that something was in motion and that she did not have all the available information. She sat beside Zoe at the laptop. "Read the screen. Press enter if you want this to be real." She was very still. Then, she turned and looked at Darnell, who was standing at the kitchen counter with both hands in his pockets and the composition notebook on the counter beside him, where it had been since last night when he'd needed to think, and the thinking had required its presence. From his jacket pocket he took a ring. A gold band, plain, no embellishment. Something chosen because it was exactly itself and nothing additional. He didn't kneel. He stood where he was because kneeling was its own kind of performance, and he had spent enough of his life in positions that reduced him. He looked at Lorraine Mitchell across his kitchen, across the table that had held 9 years of midnight mathematics, and every meal he'd cooked for Zoe, and the photograph of Diane still on the refrigerator, because Diane was part of this story and always would be. "I don't have a prepared speech," his voice steady in the way of someone who is not holding themselves steady, but who is simply, genuinely sure. "I know what I want. I want to keep arguing about important things with someone who argues back without flinching. I want Zoe to grow up knowing that her father chose well, and chose for the right reasons. And I want to stop treating the idea of being loved by someone I love in return like a risk that requires more assessment before I can allow it." He paused. "I've done enough risk assessment. Press enter." Zoe, from the laptop. "That's her line, Dad." Lorraine made a sound that lived in the overlap between laughing and crying, where the best things live. She turned back to the screen. She pressed enter. The screen bloomed sparks taking flight from the new room, rising through pixel clouds into open sky, the small music Darnell had added on a Tuesday night, at 1:30 in the morning, playing its simple motif while Zoe slept in the next room. Lorraine stood, crossed the kitchen. She took the ring from his hand and placed it on her own finger, which he had not anticipated and which was completely right, because Lorraine Mitchell had never been a person who waited for things to be done for her when she could do them herself. Yes, she said. Simple. The way she said the things she meant most. Zoe slid off her chair, crossed the kitchen, wedged herself between them with her arms around both their middles, and pressed her face into the space between them. I made that room harder than the others. On purpose, she said, slightly muffled. To make sure you were both actually paying attention. Darnell looked down at the top of her head, then at Lorraine. Lorraine looked back at him. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it did on Sunday mornings in late winter, getting quieter before it got loud again. Trees still bare, light white and thin. The city breathing in the long rhythm it borrowed from the people living in it. Inside the apartment, 3 people stood in a kitchen where everything real had always happened and would keep happening. Not a fairy tale. Not a rescue narrative. Not the story of a genius discovered, or a CEO humanized, or a child who was precocious beyond her years. Though all of those things had some truth in them, just 3 people, choosing each other in a kitchen, in Atlanta, on a Sunday morning, which was, when you looked at it honestly, exactly enough. And in the corner of the whiteboard in Darnell's office on the 18th floor, the question he'd written the day he moved in remained exactly where he'd left it. What does it cost to make someone invisible, and who pays that cost? He hadn't erased it. He didn't intend to. Not because it had been answered, it hadn't been answered. Not fully, not yet. But because the work of answering it was ongoing and required witnesses, required a room with a door that opened in both directions and stayed open. He knew about that kind of door now. He'd walked through one on a Tuesday night with a cleaning cart and a key card and 9 years of midnight mathematics in his chest and a red marker in his hand and no plan except to address the wrongness he couldn't walk past. The door was still open. It always had been. That was the part nobody had told him, not because it was a secret, but because the people who already had key cards had stopped noticing the door a long time ago. They'd gotten so used to walking through it that they'd forgotten it was there. Forgotten that for some people it was the whole question. He hadn't forgotten. He didn't intend to. And now, in a kitchen in Atlanta on a Sunday morning in February, with Zoe still pressed between them and Lorraine's hand warm in his, and sparks flying through pixel clouds on a laptop screen in the background. Now he understood something he hadn't understood when he'd first walked onto that stage and looked out at 500 faces. He hadn't been telling them his story. He'd been telling them about the door.